The bookie noticed it before anyone else did. Not because he was brave, not because he was smart, but because counting was the only thing he trusted. He stood just inside the club doorway, one hand on the frame, the other holding a cigarette that had burned too long without being smoked. The night air moved in and out with the music. Jazz spilled onto the sidewalk in soft waves, then faded as the door swung back. And every time it opened, he counted. 1, 2, 3. The same faces, the same coats, the same hats pulled low enough to be deliberate. By the time he reached 9, he stopped pretending this was coincidence. They weren't talking. They weren't laughing. They weren't even pretending to wait for someone. They were just there, like furniture placed too carefully, like men told where to stand. He'd seen men loiter before. Harlem sidewalks were full of loitering, gamblers waiting for luck, drunks waiting for courage, lovers waiting for apologies. But this was different. These men weren't waiting. They were positioned. The bookie leaned a little farther into the doorway. The smoke from his cigarette curled past his face and into the night like a quiet signal. 9. He counted them again, slower this time, as if the number might change if he looked hard enough. 9. A number that felt intentional. A number that felt like a message. Inside the club, nothing had changed. A trumpet cried softly near the stage. Glasses tapped. Someone laughed too loud at a joke nobody else heard. Cards shuffled at the back table where the regulars played for money that would change hands 5 times before sunrise. Normal. But the sidewalk wasn't normal. And the bookie had lived in Harlem long enough to understand something important. When the sidewalk changed, the night changed. He didn't know who the men were. Didn't recognize their faces. That was the first problem. Harlem had a way of knowing its own. Even strangers got recognized after 10 minutes. Someone's cousin, someone's brother, someone's trouble. But these men belonged to nobody, which meant they belonged to someone. He crushed the cigarette against the doorframe and lit another one without thinking. His eyes never left the sidewalk. One of the men shifted his weight. Another checked his watch, but too quickly, like he didn't want to be seen doing it. They weren't relaxed. They were alert, like men waiting for a cue. The bookie swallowed. He had a sudden, uncomfortable thought. They weren't watching the club. They were waiting for someone to arrive, and that thought brought a name into his head. Young Fast? He almost said it out loud. Bumpy Johnson? He didn't know why. He didn't know how, but the thought landed heavy and certain. Because this wasn't how you waited for a fight. This was how you waited for a man. The bookie stepped fully outside now, pretending to adjust the sign above the door. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, like a man doing a chore he had done 1,000 times. But his eyes kept counting. 9. The street light above them flickered once, then steadied. Shadows shifted across their coats. Their shoes were polished. Too polished for men pretending to be casual. Nobody smoked. Nobody leaned. Nobody joked. They stood like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence that hadn't been spoken yet. A cab rolled past. None of them looked at it. A couple walked by, laughing. The laughter died as soon as they passed the group, as if they had walked through cold air. The bookie felt it then. That pressure in the chest, the kind that doesn't come from danger you can see, but from danger that hasn't started yet. He went back inside the club, but he didn't close the door all the way. He left it cracked, just enough to keep the sidewalk in his peripheral vision. He didn't tell anyone, didn't warn the bartender, didn't nudge the dealer at the card table, didn't whisper to the bouncer. Because in Harlem, you didn't say Bumpy's name unless you were sure, and he wasn't sure. Not yet. But he kept counting. Every time the door moved. Every time the music dipped. Every time his heartbeat reminded him that something was off. 9. Still. 9. And then something else happened. People inside the club started feeling it too. Not knowing why, a man at the bar turned and glanced toward the door for no reason. A woman stopped mid-sentence and looked over her shoulder. Even the trumpet player hesitated on a note and had to find it again. Tension moved through the room like a draft. Invisible. Cold. The bookie realized something else. Nobody outside was trying to come in. Nobody inside was trying to leave. The sidewalk had become a line nobody wanted to cross. He checked the clock on the wall. 10 minutes had passed, but it felt longer. The kind of long that stretches when something is about to happen and everyone can feel it, but nobody knows what shape it will take. He stepped back outside again. 9. One of the men finally moved. Just a small adjustment of his coat collar, but it was enough to confirm it. They weren't there for the club. They were there for the man who owned the night around it. The bookie's mouth went dry. He didn't know who sent them. Mob? Out-of-town muscle? A message from someone who didn't understand Harlem? It didn't matter, because they had made one mistake. They chose to wait on a sidewalk that didn't belong to them, and Harlem had a way of correcting mistakes like that. The bookie didn't realize he was holding his breath until headlights turned the corner at the far end of the street. Not fast, not loud. Just a car, moving at the speed of someone who wasn't in a hurry. But the moment it appeared, all 9 men looked up at the exact same time. Like a reflex, like they had been waiting for that specific sight, the bookie didn't know why, but he felt a strange calm settle over him. A certainty. He didn't need to see the driver. He didn't need to see the face. He already knew. Bumpy Johnson was about to arrive, and for the first time in 10 minutes, the bookie stopped counting the men. Because the number that mattered now was 1. Inside the club, nobody announced it. Nobody stood up. Nobody shouted. Nobody ran to the windows. But Harlem felt it. The way a room feels a storm before the thunder arrives. The door stayed slightly open, just enough for the night air to breathe in and out. The music continued, soft and obedient, but it no longer filled the space the way it had 10 minutes ago. Now it floated on top of something heavier. Expectation. The bartender wiped the same glass 3 times without noticing. A woman at a table near the wall turned her chair slightly toward the entrance, pretending she wanted a better view of the band. The card players stopped talking. Not all at once. Not obviously. But the jokes grew shorter. The bets grew quieter. The shuffling of cards became the loudest sound at the table. Nobody had been told anything. Nobody knew about the 9 men for certain, but word in Harlem didn't travel through mouths. It traveled through posture, through pauses, through the way a room subtly leaned toward a doorway. The bookie stood just inside the entrance again. He wasn't pretending anymore. His eyes stayed fixed on the street like a man watching a clock that had started counting down. A few regulars noticed. They didn't ask questions, they just followed his gaze. That's how Harlem worked. You didn't ask what was wrong. You looked for where everyone else was looking, and when they saw the 9 men outside, something unspoken settled into the room. Recognition, without introduction. Those men didn't belong, and when something didn't belong in Harlem, there was only one name that mattered: Bumpy Johnson. The trumpet player on stage felt it too. He lowered his volume without thinking, like the air itself had become fragile. The piano followed. The rhythm section softened. The music adjusted to the tension. Because even the musicians understood something was happening, even if they couldn't see it. At the back of the club, near the hallway that led to the office, a young runner whispered to the dealer, "What's going on?" The dealer didn't look up from the table. He just said, "Nothing yet." That word hung there. Yet. A woman near the bar stood up and moved closer to the wall, not out of fear, but instinct. She had grown up here. She knew when the room was preparing itself for something it hoped wouldn't be necessary. Nobody panicked. That was the strange part. There was no fear in the air, just readiness, because this wasn't unfamiliar territory. Harlem had seen men try to send messages before. Harlem had seen outsiders think numbers were enough. And Harlem had seen what happened when those numbers met Bumpy Johnson's silence. The bouncer at the door didn't change his position, but his stance widened slightly. His shoulders squared. He stopped smiling at customers as they walked in, not because he was nervous, because he understood the door had become important. People started drifting away from the entrance, not in a rush, not in a pattern anyone could notice unless they were looking for it. The front of the club slowly emptied. The back slowly filled, like a tide moving away from a shoreline. Nobody wanted to be between the sidewalk and the room when Bumpy arrived, and still nobody said his name. That was the respect. You didn't prepare for Bumpy out loud. You prepared by making space. A glass fell somewhere near the bar and shattered. The sound was too loud for the moment. Several heads turned sharply toward it, then quickly away, embarrassed by how jumpy they'd become. The bartender cursed under his breath and grabbed a rag. The bookie didn't move. His eyes stayed outside. He saw the moment the 9 men straightened slightly. Not like soldiers, like men bracing themselves to be noticed. That's when he understood something that made his stomach tighten. They wanted Bumpy to see them. This wasn't an ambush. This was theater, a show of presence, a challenge without words, and the entire club felt it without being told. A challenge had been placed on the sidewalk, and everyone inside was waiting to see how Bumpy Johnson would answer it. The music grew softer still. Now it sounded like background to something else, like the soundtrack to a scene nobody had rehearsed. A man near the window whispered, "He coming?" Nobody answered him, but the silence that followed was an answer, because in Harlem, when tension gathered like this, Bumpy always came. Not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. The room didn't feel afraid. It felt confident. Because everyone there had seen this before, in different forms. They had seen men arrive with loud threats and leave quietly. They had seen Bumpy turn situations without lifting his voice. They had seen power used so gently, it looked like nothing happened at all, and that memory moved through the crowd now, like reassurance. The bookie leaned slightly toward the doorway again. Headlights washed over the club's front wall for a brief second. The 9 men shifted. Inside, 3 people near the bar held their breath at the same time without realizing it. Someone whispered, almost reverently, "He's here." Nobody confirmed it. Nobody needed to, because the moment had arrived where Harlem stopped watching the 9 men and started waiting for Bumpy Johnson to step onto the sidewalk. The 9 men had chosen their positions carefully. Not too close to the door, not too far from the light, close enough to be noticed, far enough to look casual. They weren't hiding from anyone. They were presenting themselves. That was the first thing that made them dangerous. Most men who came to Harlem with bad intentions tried to blend in. They stayed in shadows. They kept their heads down. They moved like they didn't want attention. These men stood like they were waiting for applause, coats buttoned, hats low, hands visible. They wanted to be counted, They wanted the number to travel through the club before Bumpy Johnson even arrived. Because this wasn't meant to be violence, this was meant to be pressure. A silent message that said, "We are here. We are many, and we are not afraid to stand in your street." But Harlem had its own language, and what they didn't understand was that being seen was not the same as being respected. One of the men adjusted his stance, glancing toward the club door for a fraction of a second. Another checked the street behind them, scanning for movement that hadn't happened yet. They weren't relaxed. They were performing calm. The kind of calm men practice when they expect something to test it. A delivery truck rumbled past, loud and clumsy. For a moment, it drowned out the music leaking from the club. All 9 men watched it pass without turning their heads. They stayed locked on the entrance, waiting. Not for trouble, for Bumpy, because whoever sent them understood something important. You didn't get Bumpy Johnson's attention by causing chaos in Harlem. You got his attention by standing still in a place that belonged to him. This was an invitation, or a dare, or both. One of the men, the tallest, exhaled slowly through his nose. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed this night in his head more than once. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't comfortable either. Because deep down, all of them knew something their employer probably didn't. Numbers worked in most cities. Numbers meant control. But in Harlem, numbers meant witnesses. And witnesses had memories. A couple walked out of the club laughing, then froze when they saw the group. Their laughter fell apart mid-breath. The man gently guided the woman down the sidewalk without making eye contact. The 9 men didn't react. They didn't need to. Their presence had already done the work. Inside the club, people were talking about them without speaking. Outside, the street itself felt narrower. A streetlight flickered again, casting uneven shadows across their faces. For a moment, they looked less like a unit and more like individuals. And that's when the cracks showed. One tapped his foot. Another flexed his fingers inside his coat pocket. A third swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, as if he could chew through the tension. They were waiting for a moment they couldn't control, and that was new for them. Because this wasn't a job where they kicked down a door. This was a job where they stood still and let a man walk toward them. And that required a different kind of nerve. They had been told Bumpy Johnson would come. They had been told he wouldn't ignore this. They had been told he would have to acknowledge them. But nobody had told them what that acknowledgement would look like. Would he shout? Would he bring men? Would he pretend not to notice? The uncertainty was the real weight pressing on their shoulders now. Because they weren't here to fight. They were here to be witnessed by the one man whose reaction mattered. And the longer they stood there, the more they began to understand something uncomfortable. They weren't controlling this moment anymore. They were part of it. A cat darted across the street and disappeared into an alley. One of the men flinched before catching himself. Another shot him a brief look of irritation. Small cracks, small human tells, the kind that grew when silence lasted too long. The club door creaked open slightly again. Music spilled out, softer now, and for the first time since they arrived, all 9 men felt it at the same time. The shift. The air changed. They didn't know why. They just knew. Someone important was close. They straightened instinctively, not out of fear, out of readiness, like men preparing to be inspected. Because this was the part nobody had warned them about. Bumpy Johnson didn't meet messages with messages. He met them with presence. And presence was harder to stand in front of than a weapon. At the far end of the street, headlights appeared. Not fast, not dramatic. Just a car turning the corner like any other car on any other night. But all 9 men saw it at once, and without meaning to, without planning to, they all stopped pretending to be casual. Their shoulders squared, their chins lifted, their breathing slowed. They had come to be seen. Now they were about to see the man they had come for, and none of them realized yet. That being seen by Bumpy Johnson was not the same thing as being acknowledged by him. The car did not rush. It did not announce itself with speed or noise. It rolled down the street like it belonged there, like every brick, every lamppost, every cracked piece of sidewalk had already agreed to let it pass. Headlights slid across the storefronts, touched the club door, then drifted over the 9 men waiting beneath the streetlight. For a brief second, they were illuminated. 9 figures caught in white light. 9 men who suddenly looked less certain than they had 10 minutes ago. The car slowed, not because it had to, because the man inside chose for it to. Inside the club, nobody moved. Outside, nobody spoke. The engine idled with a low, patient hum. The driver stepped out first, calm, unhurried. He didn't scan the street. He didn't tense. He simply walked around to the back door and opened it like this was the most ordinary part of his evening. And then Bumpy Johnson stepped out. No drama, no sudden motion. Just a man placing his shoes onto the sidewalk as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Because he had. His hat sat low, his coat clean, his posture relaxed in a way that couldn't be practiced. He didn't look at the 9 men. That was the first thing they noticed. He didn't even glance at them. He looked straight ahead at the club entrance, like they were part of the scenery, like lampposts, like parked cars, like details too small to matter. And in that instant, something inside the 9 men shifted. They had come to be seen, and Bumpy Johnson had not given them the courtesy. He closed the car door himself, a small, deliberate motion, the kind that said he had time, all the time in the world. The street felt different now, not tense, not loud, heavy. Like the air itself had thickened around his presence. The bookie watched from the doorway, his heart thudding against his ribs. He had expected something louder, something sharper. But this was worse. Bumpy began walking toward the club. His pace didn't change. Not when he passed the first man, not when he passed the second, not even when he was directly beside the tallest of the 9. No eye contact, no words, no acknowledgement. He walked like they weren't worth interrupting his stride. And that was the moment the performance collapsed. Because the 9 men had prepared for confrontation. They had prepared for tension. They had prepared for a reaction. They had not prepared to be treated like nothing. One of them shifted his weight, unsure whether to speak. Another felt his mouth go dry. The tallest man, the one who had seemed most confident earlier, felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Doubt. Bumpy's shoes made a soft sound against the pavement. Slow, measured, certain. The sound carried farther than it should have. Even inside the club, people heard it. He reached the door. The bookie stepped back instinctively, pulling it open wider without being asked. Bumpy didn't look at him, didn't nod, didn't say thank you. He simply walked inside, and as he crossed the threshold, the room changed shape. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The trumpet player lowered his instrument slightly. The bartender straightened without realizing it. Bumpy Johnson had entered the room without making an entrance, and somehow that was louder than shouting. He removed his hat slowly, not ceremonially, just a small, habitual motion. He handed it to the coat check without breaking stride, and continued walking toward his usual table near the back. Nobody approached him. Nobody greeted him, because everyone understood something important. This moment belonged to silence. Behind him, the 9 men still stood on the sidewalk, waiting, confused. They had expected to be the center of this night. Instead, they had been reduced to background. They glanced at each other, unsure whether the plan had already failed or hadn't started yet. Because Bumpy Johnson had done the one thing they couldn't prepare for. He had made them irrelevant without saying a word. Inside, he took his seat, calmly, like a man settling in for a long evening, like nothing unusual was happening outside, like 9 men hadn't traveled here just to stand in his street. The bookie realized then what made this so powerful. Bumpy wasn't ignoring them out of arrogance. He was ignoring them out of control. He had decided the situation did not deserve urgency, and that decision was now pressing on the 9 men harder than any threat could have, because they were still outside, and Bumpy Johnson was already comfortable inside. Bumpy Johnson did not look toward the door. He did not ask who was outside. He did not send anyone to check. He sat down like a man arriving at a familiar table in a familiar room on a familiar night. And somehow, that was the most unsettling part of all. The chair made a soft wooden sound as he pulled it back. He lowered himself into it without hurry, without stiffness, without even a glance around the room to measure the mood. Because he already knew the mood. Harlem had told him before he stepped out of the car. A waiter approached, nervous in a way he didn't understand. Bumpy didn't speak at first. He just rested his hands on the table, fingers relaxed, eyes calm. "Coffee," he said quietly. Nothing else, not a question, not a command, just a word spoken at the same volume as always. The waiter nodded and walked away too quickly. Around the room, people pretended to resume what they were doing. Cards were shuffled. Drinks were poured. The trumpet found its place again in the air, but everyone was listening to something else now. The absence of reaction. Because the longer Bumpy stayed calm, the more the 9 men outside began to feel the weight of their own presence. On the sidewalk, the tallest of them shifted his stance again. "This it?" one of the others muttered under his breath. He didn't answer, because he didn't know. They had expected confrontation. They had expected tension thick enough to cut. They had expected Bumpy Johnson to at least acknowledge that they existed. Instead, they were being erased in real time. A car drove past. None of them noticed. The club door opened briefly as someone stepped out to smoke. He looked at the group, then back inside, then chose to smoke closer to the building than usual. That small decision landed harder than words. The 9 men were starting to feel something new. Embarrassment. They were on display, and nobody was impressed. Inside, Bumpy sipped his coffee slowly. Steam rose between him and the room like a curtain. He didn't rush the cup, didn't drum his fingers, didn't lean back or forward. He simply existed at the table, and that existence was changing the temperature outside, because the message was becoming clear. If Bumpy Johnson wasn't worried, then why should anyone else be? A dealer at the card table laughed suddenly, loudly, breaking the tension by accident. The laugh spread. Not forced, not fake. Relief. The night was resuming, and the 9 men were still standing in it, with no role left to play. One of them cleared his throat. Another checked his watch again, slower this time. The tallest man felt a bead of sweat trace down his back beneath his coat. They had come to apply pressure. But pressure only worked when someone pushed back. Bumpy hadn't pushed. He hadn't even acknowledged the weight. And now, they were the ones carrying it. Minutes passed. Long, uncomfortable minutes. Inside, a woman asked the bartender for another drink and joked about the music being too soft. The bartender smiled for the first time in 20 minutes. Bumpy remained still, not frozen. Still, like a man completely at ease with time. The bookie realized what was happening with a slow, dawning clarity. Bumpy wasn't waiting for them to make a move. He was waiting for them to understand they didn't have one. Outside, the tallest man finally spoke, low and tight. "He's not coming out." Another replied, "He ain't doing nothing." That was the problem. Bumpy Johnson was doing nothing, and nothing was dismantling them. Because every second they remained outside without a response made them look smaller, less important, less threatening. A group of young men walked down the sidewalk, laughing. They passed the 9 without slowing down, without even glancing at them. Earlier, people had avoided the area. Now they were ignoring it. The message had flipped. The bookie watched this from the doorway and felt a strange admiration settle in his chest. This was how Bumpy handled things. Not with noise, with patience. He let other men realize their own mistake. Inside, Bumpy finished his coffee. He set the cup down gently. The sound of porcelain touching the saucer was almost delicate. He stood up, and that single motion sent a ripple through the club. Heads turned, not dramatically, but in unison. Outside, the 9 men saw movement through the door, and for the first time since arriving, they felt a sharp, involuntary spike of nerves. Because now, finally, something was happening. But they didn't realize the most important part. It wasn't happening to Bumpy Johnson. It was happening to them.